Damien, the General Secretary of the NTEU, National Tertiary Education Union, and Craig Laughton, who's got an even more complicated an acronym, is the Executive Director of AHEIA, the Australian Higher Education Industrial Association. Thank you, gents. I know that you made time to come, and I'm grateful to you. Mike's. These two blokes have got probably two of the hardest jobs in Australian education. Dr. Cahill is standing down in September from memory after 3 terms. 3 terms?
One term in this role, yeah. And then another term in the New South Wales division.
Right. It's been a hugely successful term in putting the union at the centre of the industrial and policy game in Australian universities. The NTEU has led governance change in assessing council's performance, and there's been its long campaign on staff underpayment. And I'd argue that's probably the most important factor in putting university management's treatment of staff on the public agenda. Fair Work Ombudsman has said that it's engaged with just about every public university who've got pay wrong. Generally, in my view, it's incompetence rather than malice, but they've still got it wrong. That impact is in the public mind. Craig Laughton at AHEIA, an equally demanding job, in some way much harder because it is so policy focused. He's dealing with all but invisible issues that shape pay and conditions at the interface of politics and legislation. I remember he explained to me once the problem with the government's decision to create in the new IR law 2 short-term contracts. You must be offered a continuing one, and the difficulties that created for the medical research establishment. Both of them are deep in policy, and they're deep in the political implications of it. I thank you both very much for sparing the time. I know you made efforts to get here, both of you. Thank you. How do you want to do this? Do you want Senate opening statements, or do you just want to go to questions straight up?
Happy to take questions.
Questions. Damien, standing down in a couple of months, going back to the University of Sydney?
That's right, going back to my old job as a rank and file NTEU member, University of Sydney, Department of Political Economy.
Where do you leave the union in terms of its relations with the system?
I think, it's been a difficult... So I got elected to a full-time role with the union in 2018. From 2020 onwards, it's been a really difficult time for the sector, starting with COVID, but not ending with COVID. And those COVID years were a really difficult time for our union as well, because we faced mass redundancies, many of which in our view weren't justified. There were internal political conflicts arising from how to deal with those redundancies. We were facing at the time a federal government that was unsympathetic to the sector. So it was a difficult time for the sector, difficult time for the union. But I think, when I go back to the sector at the end of this year, leaving the union in a much stronger place. I think, as you intimated, our public standing has increased enormously. I think not since the mid 90s have we had such an influence on public debate. We've elevated the issue of wage theft to something that's taken seriously, whereas before the pandemic, it quite frankly was denied as an issue within the sector, in my view. We've elevated the issue of university governance to a matter of public concern. We've grown our membership significantly over the last 4 years. We've got an NTEU, a negotiated enterprise agreement at every single public university in the country. So I think I'm leaving it in a good place. I think the next frontier really, in terms of public policy, is around funding. That is proving to be the toughest nut to crack, but that's something that will remain a priority for the next leadership team.
Which really is very interesting, because that's moving from straight industrial relations issues into taking a more policy-based leadership role nationally.
Oh, I think we'll continue to do both. I mean, I can get more into the industrial relations side of things, but in terms of, I guess, nationally significant matters, I think, you know, funding sits beneath industrial relations. So funding is such a driver of industrial relations that the two are intimately linked.
I just add quickly that there is a New South Wales Anti-Corruption Commission inquiry this week into the University of Wollongong. They're having hearings today. That would not have happened without a grassroots effort involving your members at the University of Wollongong. I don't know what's going to happen, but it's a hell of a thing to be going on. Craig Laughton, things like that make your life ever more difficult because people assume that's the norm in the system. You're dealing with the mass of policy matters day in, day out. Is it a tougher job than Damien's?
I don't know if it's a tougher job. I think what we're seeing in terms of the way that AHEIA and the NTEU both work, I think what we're seeing is a maturation in terms of the relationship. It's far more collegiate in terms of that. We certainly disagree, and we disagree vehemently on many things, but ultimately I think in terms of the sector to actually move through our current situation, it's going to involve some collaborative thinking with all stakeholders, a little less adversarial thought processes, and then trying to work to bring the regulators along. And I think that's the real key challenge at the moment that faces both of us.
So just in your case, trying to bring some of your members along. Every couple of months I see a case which your head must explode as a university does something that may be well-intentioned but publicly looks pretty dumb.
Yeah, look, I think where the university sits at the moment from the way we see it is we've had a Sarah Lee cheesecake, showing my age there, of regulation that's been cascading down for the last 2.5 years, right? And that has been, again, with the best intention from the regulators and the government in terms of that space. But what we are seeing at the moment, I think it's fair to say, is that the sector is struggling to keep up with compliance obligations under that regime, let alone building culture of governance across the sector. And they're two very different things, compliance and a governance culture. So what I see at the moment in terms of some of the things that happen in the sector, I think it's as much a function at the moment that we are being inundated by regulation. That regulation is not necessarily thought through and coherent, albeit some of it is very well intentioned, but I think that's also creating the perfect breeding ground for issues that we're seeing, whether it be underpayment issues, whether it be, you know, structuring issues across the sector that don't go down well in terms of that. I think there are a myriad of causes happening at the moment. Hopefully we can work through those over the next sort of 24 months as the regulatory environment surely must be starting to subside, and then we can see the true impact of that. What is working, what isn't working in terms of that.
That strikes me as enormously optimistic. TEXA is throwing its weight around. No one knows what ATEC is going to do, but I have a terrible suspicion they're going to be like the people in the Russian universities who decided they'd throw $3 billion at things and fix it through regulation. Does an interventionist government get the burden regulation puts on your members?
At the moment, I think, as I said, we're heavily interacting with the government, right, and with the regulators. And the first thing I've got to say, nobody is out there, what I'm seeing at least, hunting down universities. That's the first thing I think we need to clear up. There's a mea culpa. There are certain things in our sector that we need to do better. I think it's fair to say from a governance perspective, having come from the corporate sector and US multinationals myself, we're probably 15 to 20 years behind what I'd call a governance culture that's inbred. That takes time. That doesn't come through passing a raft of regulations and laws, right? You need to give the sector time to ventilate and cultivate that culture. And to the extent that you're so focused on compliance for compliance sake, as opposed to propagating governance, that's when it becomes problematic. That's why I'm optimistic, right? Because I saw this when Sarbanes-Oxley came in many years ago in the US. And all the US listed companies, we threw our hands up and said, this is ridiculous. You want to know all these things about what we're doing. And it was a similar type of reaction. But ultimately, where the corporate world has landed now, it's a far better place. It's far more transparent, and the governance is actually a culture of governance, particularly in the top publicly listed companies, more so than it was 25 years ago. So that's where I'm optimistic in terms of that space.
Is there a tension, Damien, in how a union participates in a national system where most of the decisions and most of the arguments are down at individual institution basis, that you've got internal political issues internally between what state and national leaderships need with local branches?
I mean, there are always tensions in a federal organisation like ours, and in interacting with different forms of government. But I mean, one of the principles of trade unionism is solidarity, and so we have internal mechanisms that allow us to coordinate our members and our activities across the country. Within that, there's obviously agency and discretion of local branches and divisions, but certainly that's the approach we take to enterprise bargaining, for example. We coordinate our bargaining across the country. It's not pattern bargaining, but it is coordinated, and I think that's how we get the best outcomes for our members, and how we mediate I think some of the wasteful competition between universities and ensure that the smaller and weaker universities are pulled up and people aren't, and the discrepancies in conditions between universities aren't as significant as they otherwise would be if that coordination didn't occur.
And that strikes me as what you've done in the governance campaign that you've run over the last year and a half. That this has really been about a policy choice, that you want to see a change in the mix of university governance.
No, that's right. Well, I mean, we've been campaigning in the NTEU for 15 to 20 years for both governance reform and funding reform. They've been consistent priorities for the union over many, many years. And in the last 2 years, we've finally got traction on governance reform. So, it's been a lot of headlines recently about malfeasance or alleged malfeasance at some universities. To our mind, this isn't new. We've been highlighting examples of this for a decade and a half, but it's only now that it's got traction. And so we're pushing hard on that, because we think both funding and governance reform are crucial to reforming our universities. I think it's good you mentioned the University of Wollongong earlier, and it is worth remembering that today the Independent Commission Against Corruption is investigating alleged serious malfeasance at the University of Wollongong, and in the next 2 weeks, presumably the current Chancellor is going to be interviewed, and potentially the former acting Vice-Chancellor is going to be interviewed as well. They haven't been released yet. The ICAC doesn't take on frivolous cases, so at this forum that we both spoke at, I think last year, it was probably this time last year, that coincided, I think, with Genevieve Bell leaving ANU. I think I said at that forum something like, that should be a wake-up call for the sector. That should be the canary in the coal mine in terms of governance. I don't think it has been. To be frank, I think what I hear from a lot of employers, and I'm not levelling this at you, Craig, but a lot of employers, is a denial of the seriousness of the malfeasance that exists within university governance. I'm not saying at every university, but the ease with which we have been able to uncover things like what's happened at the ANU, what's happened at Wollongong, I think suggests that it is quite widespread. And I think the attitude from the leadership of the sector is getting in the way of political campaign to unlock funding, because I think it's going to be very difficult for the government to be able to credibly put forward a program of funding reform when the view of universities is that there's widespread malpractice at the top.
Yeah. I should just add that the inquiry at the University of Wollongong does not include the Vice-Chancellor, Max Liu. He arrived long after this started. It has nothing to do with it. Max Liu, former interim Vice-Chancellor. Max Liu is an outstanding operator, he really is. Craig?
So just in terms of, ANU is a really interesting one, right? So let's just rip the Band-Aid off that just a little bit. If you look at the constituent acts that set up ANU, one of the key things that's what I found really interesting when we talked about governance, right? It's their council had a couple of members from the House of Representatives and a couple of members from the Senate. Its annual report was scrutinised by the Attorney General and the Attorney General and someone from Treasury as well, right? So in terms of governance safeguards, if you've got that level of alleged competence on your university board, question is, what were they doing? Who had their hands on the wheel? And governance, I come back to, and this is not a blame game or anything like that, but I do think it's really, really important to understand you can have the best governance framework set up on the planet, but if you don't have the competency and having the right people on your university councils, A, and if you don't have a culture of governance, B, it doesn't matter. You can pass whatever regulations you like, right? You'll only ever have a compliance culture. And the key thing, and I say this, and I mean this earnestly, really good governance is not doing something because I have to. Really good governance occurs when you do that when the lights are out, when nobody's looking, because it's the right thing to do. Now, the trajectory that we're on at the moment, look, it's almost like you're taking some medicine and we're going to feel unwell over the next couple of years while we bed this down and we give time to propagate a culture of governance. It is not going to happen overnight, right? And it's not making excuses, but you just have to have a look at what happens elsewhere around the world when you embark on these types of programs. So I think what we need to do as a sector, and I think this is really important as well, the sector has been kicked from pillar to post over the last 2 to 3, 4 years, on whether it be underpayments, whether it be governance issues, etc. At some stage, we need to take a step back and go, okay, yes, some of these things we need to work through, and there's no excuses for some of these things that have occurred, but we need time to propagate this culture. And if we keep having hand grenades raining in on the very people who are trying to propagate that culture, that is only going to be counterproductive. Right? It's not excuses, but it's just explanation. And we need to get a little bit more rational, a little less emotive, and just invest in the culture of governance.
How does that going to sit with the government's new advisor? I think it's continuing advisory committee on university governance that's put recommendations out last year.
Look, it's interesting. And you mentioned ATEC, and you mentioned TEXA as well. I think there's a real risk at the moment. We're having a race for regulation, right? And each of these bodies are flexing their new muscles. In terms of TEXA, obviously, I think we'll get some significantly more powers over the next sort of 18 months to 24 months. And then it'll be interesting to see where they're trying to carve out their space, their relationship with the flow and how that works as well. So I think the real risk at the moment is if we keep piling on with the best intention all these things, it is going to be, if it isn't already, counterproductive, because there's only so much medication that you can take in one hit before the wheels fall off. And the people at the moment who are administering all these changes, the very people who are doing the payrolls, who are doing all the governance aspects in the universities, they are drowning. They're leaving our sector in droves because it's too much. So if you lose the capability, and that's the other key thing that we don't have in the sector at the moment, corporate sector's capability in terms of governance 101, I think is significantly better than the university sector on the basis that they've been doing it longer, right? So they've got a deeper pool of talent, and we're struggling to attract that talent that we need to our sector because of all the noise that is ongoing.
Damien, is greater regulation your friend, your member's friend?
It's a good question. I think if you ask our members, probably particularly, but not only our academic members, what one of their greatest frustrations is, they would probably reply the increasing administrative burden that they feel. And what we've observed is that as the sector has become more marketised over the last 20 years, it's not a novel observation, it's also become more bureaucratised. And a lot of our members would say a lot of the risk that comes from being a marketised university is pushed down onto them. And then a lot of the regulatory compliance obligations are also pushed onto them. And that eats into time where they would otherwise be teaching or doing research, not properly counted in the workload formulas, etc. So there is an issue there, for sure, but I think that needs to be balanced against the clear need for government action in this case. Now, that's not to say that they've got it all right, but in terms of university governance, it's been clear that there hasn't been a will for reform from within, so the government has taken that on. So I think that regulatory burden, as I said, needs to be balanced against, in this case, the need to act. But it is a real thing for our members.
Round 10 of enterprise bargaining is on... 9, is it 9? Okay. Round 9 of enterprise bargaining is underway. Is it too complicated?
I don't think it's too complicated. I mean, the enterprise agreement system in the university sector is very durable. So we've had enterprise agreements for since the very inception of enterprise bargaining, since the mid-1990s. So it's a very, very durable system. It's imperfect, obviously. But I think if you just look at what's happening in this round of bargaining, where we're managing to reach agreement much more quickly than in the last round, I wouldn't say it's overly complicated or cumbersome or anything like that. We advocate for the rights and conditions of our members. We take it really, really seriously. We do have good conditions in the university sector, there's no doubt about that. And I think that's because of that history of bargaining.
Great.
Two things. One, the second one might be a little bit controversial. In terms of where we sit with bargaining at the moment, I think one of the key issues that we've got with the regulatory reform, the inability of universities to take an enterprise agreement to be arbitrated on by the Fair Work Commission. So effectively, and I don't want to get too technical, but 270A, intractable bargaining, you get stuck, you go to the Commission, and the Commission can't sort of rule on something that makes the enterprise agreement effectively worse off than it was previously. So one of the issues we're facing from a bargaining framework perspective at the moment is from a productivity perspective. If you're hamstrung by what you can actually change there, and if you can't take that to a third-party umpire because you're deadlocked, that seems to me to be a little bit problematic. The second thing is, it really does my head in 2026 if you think you're entering into an agreement with for 3, sometimes 3.5 years, maybe 4, practically, by the time you agree to the next one. You think of how far AI and our workplaces are going to change. I would like to see, and maybe this is something we can talk about in the future, I think we need to have a look at a new framework that is far more flexible to deal with the changes in the workplace, because we talk about the governance that's coming through. When you've got an archaic framework, which is, again, great intentions, and it has been very robust over a long period of time, but I'm not sure in terms of where we sit at the moment in terms of the flexibility that we need with the changes and the rate that changes are coming, that it's fit for purpose anymore as much as it once was.
Oh, I'll just respond to that. So, I mean, in terms of intractable bargaining, for those who aren't familiar with it, that's something that arose from the current government's first tranche of industrial relations reforms, and one of, I think, the unintended consequences of their initial legislation in that area was to create the possibility of arbitrating an enterprise agreement, so the Commission fully determining the contents of an enterprise agreement rather than staff at a university or a workplace being able to determine it. And the reference point was community standards, which is obviously problematic in the higher education sector, where the employment standards are quite high, and then the danger was that an arbitrated outcome could lead to a serious erosion of workplace conditions, and that's why unions across the country lobbied the government to change that. And now there's the no less favourable test. So you can still have an arbitrated outcome, you can still get the Commission to assist the parties in bargaining, it's called Section 240, but you can't reduce the overall conditions of the enterprise agreement through that. The current agreement's a reference point. So I think that's a sensible decision, and it hasn't inhibited bargaining at all. In fact, what we're seeing, as I said before, is that we're reaching agreement much more quickly under those new laws than was the case in the last round of bargaining. Just on artificial intelligence, I mean, that is the most significant workplace issue in the sector, in my view. It's an existential issue for the university sector, artificial intelligence. It is going to transform the sector one way or another, and that's why we're looking for and getting agreement on a range of safeguards in enterprise agreements so that there are clear guidelines and obligations around the introduction of artificial intelligence in workplaces, which are all about co-design, co-determination and consultation with staff, so that if we're going to use AI, it's used to enhance educational outcomes and not undermine it.
I wonder whether both of you represent organisations and memberships that have a lot vested in the system as it now works and is now and now applies, and that over the next 5 to 10 years change may be imposed upon you, that you're really just not in a position with your existing structures to deal with.
Well, I think with AI, that is going to be a radical change to the sector. I mean, I'm not sure how much university leaders have. I mean, George is here today. I'd be interested to hear George's view later, but I'm not sure how much university leaders have thought this through. But I mean, AI is an existential threat to the value proposition of universities, potentially, because what AI does from an employer's point of view is it replaces intellectual labour with artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is becoming more and more capable, able to do more and more complex things. It's already, from just a purely instrumentalist point of view, able to perform so many elements of the academic labour process. It already can substitute, even if imperfectly, for so many elements of the academic labour process: consultation, marking, curriculum design, potentially classroom facilitation, potentially lecturing at some point, maybe already. And so I think what we need to consider with respect to AI is, if employers go down that path, and it'll be very attractive because presumably the marginal cost of an AI bot is going to be less than the marginal cost of an academic. So from a cost minimisation point of view, it's going to be incredibly attractive. But if we get to the point where courses are predominantly delivered by artificial intelligence, which is the logical endpoint, I'm not saying that's the design, but it's a logical endpoint, then you have to ask, what's the value proposition of a university, and what differentiates a university from, ChatGPT University, for example, to take a hyperbolic example. And therefore, why would students come to study at university? I think the answer to that, the value proposition of universities, is always going to be its staff.
Which puts the pressure on your members to generate and maintain the esprit de corps of a radically changed workforce.
Yeah, I look at, I do share some of the concerns Damien talks about AI, and I think they are real. But the flip side is, maybe I'm just an eternal optimist, the AI presents this sector with a very unique opportunity, I think, to step up and show leadership for the rest of the Australian economy in terms of how to adopt AI, right? And what I mean by that, and it's a simple, stupid analogy, right? I don't know about you, but I like when I go to the supermarket every now and then going through the cashier and have someone to talk to when I do the groceries. I would like, as a shareholder of Woolies, that someone there would show some thought, bloody leadership, and say, right, you know what? That personal experience is valued to my customer. Picking up what Damien's saying, I think it's incumbent upon universities as we move forward. The value proposition evolves so heavily around that university experience for what it is. It's time that the sector embraced that. It's time that we took that thought leadership out and we showed the rest of the economy how to deal with this. We don't want the big banks running rampant with AI and sacking everybody and everything else. If we put AI in every function of universities, what's that mean to us when we're churning out undergrads? We're already seeing in the US, for example, a 10%, 12% year-on-year decrease in the amount of undergrads. That's our product, right? That's what we're selling in terms of that. So we do need to be very careful in terms of that. We need to balance the productivity. We don't just use AI because we can. We need to take a little bit more mature approach to that. But the opportunity is huge to set what I call the AI moral compass in how that works in a sector. And what better sector to do that but this sector?
And that involves both of you bringing this audience with you, not the union activists in the branches alone, and certainly not just obviously management, but both speaking, the sector as a whole, speaking to the community. I think that's a very hard thing to do.
Well, you've got to start somewhere, and the flip side is this. I was thinking about this last night, right, with AI. It's the analogy of in the 80s when I was growing up, they still had the cigarette commercials on telly. Everybody knew those things were carcinogenic and ultimately going to cause some pretty harm down the track. I kind of think it's a bit, what Damien's detailed now in terms of the analogy of where it could ultimately lead. I don't think you have to be Einstein to work that out. And if you've got 20 to 30% of your population without a job, what do they do? Cause a lot of trouble. So we actually need to think that through a little bit more while we have the runway. And if we don't do anything, yes, you will create the reality that because you haven't actually invested in that thought leadership and had those hard discussions to actually create that moral compass and create some framework for moving forward.
Damien?
Yeah, well, just to your point about AI and leadership, I mean, we've been disappointed by the government's orientation with respect to AI. They've basically devolved the regulation of AI to individual sectors and individual corporations. So I think they've caved too much to big tech on AI, in my view. But I have been encouraged with respect to enterprise bargaining so far with how we've been able to reach agreement with employers on the regulation of AI through enterprise agreements. There has been some resistance, but I think we've landed in a good place. So I think, the government has basically devolved that responsibility to us, and one way to do that is through enterprise agreements. That's something we can shape together, and I think we're doing it. I think I'm happy with the outcomes so far.
And the positive thing from the employer's perspective is the employers are smart people here. They're university people. They get it, right? So they're not going to bite their own hand off in terms of the decisions they make in the short and medium term. But we just need to actually take a moment to step back and just calibrate where that compass sits. What a fantastic opportunity, right? What a fantastic opportunity.
Questions? Gentlemen, and the lady, I'm sorry.
Liz Burray says it's older than 40 years old. Is it time for something that really suits where we are now for what people are looking for? We have a very complex system.
I think there's a case, I mean, Craig and I have discussed this. I think one area where I think it would be worth revisiting as a sector would be the professional staff classifications. So professional staff work has evolved radically in the last 20 or 30 years. I mean, it's an incredibly diverse section of the workforce. Professional staff, perform all kinds of roles, from manual labour through to highly complex intellectual labour. There's a real diversity of roles there. So I think there's a case for looking at the professional staff classification descriptors, but I think the only way to do that usefully and responsibly would be at the sector-wide level. It would be through a review of the award. And I think, but that would be an incredibly resource-intensive process. I think if the government were willing to fund it, I think the union, and Craig can speak for AHEIA, but we would certainly be willing to participate in a process like that.
Yeah, so two things on that front. We've started that award review process at AHEIA, and one of the things that has come out of the award working group is that we want to have a look at the descriptors and work through that process. So hopefully we can keep moving that forward. I think that is very necessary. But the other elephant in the room is the workload models and how they apply to the academics as well, and just having more flexibility. As I said before, does that system work in good, bad or ugly? Does it work in rationally in 2026 if you're trying to move and make your university relevant today? I think these restrictions and some of these artificial restrictions in the enterprise agreements need to have a really good look at.
Yeah, lady in the middle there.
Given the fiscal challenges of universities and ongoing funding challenges from the government, are you anticipating further university mergers soon?
That's a really good question. It's certainly being talked about. There'd be people here who know more about it than I do. I mean, it's certainly a live issue in Western Australia, as I understand. I think it's also the case that a number of our smaller regional universities are struggling financially. Their business model has been absolutely blown apart by the rise of online education. They struggle to attract international students. The big GO8s can now hoover up so many online enrolments. I think it's really put them under pressure. So I think there might, and remember that was talked about in the initial accord document, you know, one big regional university. I don't think that's entirely disappeared, that idea. So I think there will be pressure for mergers in the future. Have to say the Adelaide University process has been really instructive in that regard. I think that the unions played a really positive role in trying to make that a smooth process and one that protects staff whilst building up the university at the same time. But I would hate to see us lose any of our regional universities. I think they're so, having studied at regional universities myself, they are so important to those regional communities. If anything, I mean, they need greater government support at the moment.
Let me just add to that. I can speak to that. I watched the merger of the University of South Australia and the University of Adelaide pretty closely, and it happened largely due to a lot of very, very hard work, in part by your members, your leadership. There was a commitment, as far as I can tell, right across the system to make it happen. There is an enormous amount of complaint and grievance, but unsurprising given the complexity involved. But it was a huge effort, and it wouldn't have happened without the two VCs, but your branch secretary and colleagues. Just quickly, Craig, we're on time.
Yep. So I think the clarity in terms of that merger stuff with ATEC will come with the university compacts. I think what we're starting to see is, I think ultimately they'll use the compact process to articulate the purpose of each of the universities. That then will actually help bed down whether things should merge or not merge. I think Damien's right. It'd be very sad if we saw mergers of universities. You look at the WA experience, and if you talk on the ground, people are going, well, what's the point in merging those universities at the moment? Because in 10 years' time with population growth, we're going to need those different centres, and the benefits that we gain in terms of the university mergers take about 10 years to actually genuinely throw through the system. So hopefully we'll see some common sense. And in Canberra, what we're seeing, it seems to be a bit of a mixture and more erring on the side of potentially keeping the same structure, but have it better defined in terms of the roles of each individual university, which I think will help universities hang around, particularly when we get the funding models right.
We're out of time. Craig Laughton, Damien Cahill, thank you very much for coming today.